Hello everyone, and happy Steel Day 2018. Welcome to this year's Steel Day webinar, Birth of the Steel Skyscraper, presented today by Benjamin Schaefer. My name is Brent Liu. I'm with AISC, and I will be moderating today's presentation. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Benjamin Schaefer. Dr. Schaefer is a professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. He is also active in engineering consulting and is currently the Vice President of NBM Technologies. He received his PhD from Cornell University in Structural Engineering and his BSE with honors and distinction from the University of Iowa. Professor Schaefer is the Director of the Cold Form Steel Research Consortium and North American editor of the journal Thin-Walled Structures. He also serves on the AISI as well as the AISC specification committees. He's previously served as Chair of the Department of Civil Engineering at Johns Hopkins, the Chair of the Structural Stability Research Council, as well as the President of the Cold Form Steel Engineers Institute. He is an avid winning teacher, and we're pleased to have him present today's Steel Day webinar. Ben, thanks for being here, and I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you, Brent. Much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for taking a little time out of your Steel Day to hear a little more of the story of how steel skyscrapers came to be such an important component of the urban built environment, and maybe learn a few stories about some engineers you haven't heard of before. I'm excited to give you these stories and tell you a little about these early engineers that brought the steel skyscraper to life. But I need to credit a few people that helped me get to this point to be able to tell you this story. Sanjay Arwade and Steve Bonapani are fellow academic colleagues that I have taught a course called Perspectives on the Evolution of Structures over the years, and many times co-taught it with them, including at their various universities. David Billington is recently passed away, longtime creator of the concepts of structural art, and his book, The Tower and the Bridge, formed the beginning basis for many of the inquiries that I'm going to talk about today. And Thomas Leslie is currently the nation's most impressive scholar on the history of Chicago structures, which we're going to be focused on today. He's a history professor at Iowa State. And my father, who's been helping me for the last several years, work on a labor of love book related to some of these topics. So I want to begin just sort of framing out your mind and thinking about, the really great cities of the world and the role that skyscrapers and steel skyscrapers have come to take in those urban environments. I mean, they have become the embodiment of what we think of when we think of cities, even though cities sprawl huge domains. The central business district of cities is really what we think about when we think about the skyscape of Chicago or Hong Kong or even Boston or New York. And how did this come to be? There are many reasons, but I'm going to tell one important thread of the story, and that one begins with the absolute loss and destruction of Chicago's central business district. So in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed an enormous portion of the working area, the central business area of Chicago. So the map on the right gives you some idea of the burnt portion of central Chicago, essentially the entire loop. That social condition, right? I mean, just you lose your entire downtown, created a moment in time where there was a great desire for innovation and rebuilding. And that is one of the conditions that led to the sort of growth of the skyscraper in downtown Chicago. But there's a lot of other things going on at the same time. Some of them are related specifically to Chicago. Some of them are external factors. So in Chicago proper, although many of you know it's a city which spreads out an enormous number of square miles, the lake and the railroads actually and the river sort of cut off the loop in a very specific way. And so there is a lot of commerce in this one specific portion of the city. And there is, in the late 1800s, for the first time, there is this new thing called the white-collar office worker. So, the accountant, the business manager, et cetera, the corporations have a desire to have a large number of workers in a small location so they can handle their corporate functions. And so much the better if it's close to all the goods and services that are being pushed north-south in the U.S. and east-west in the U.S. on the railroads. And so there's a really strong desire and push to build buildings and recover from the Great Chicago Fire. And there's also other things that we won't talk about as much, but of course the elevator is invented around the same time, at least a safe version of the elevator. And so there's just a lot of conditions that are ripe for change in the commercial office space at this particular moment. This gives rise to a group of men known as the First Chicago School. If our Steel Day was a celebration that was primarily housed with architects, all of you would have heard many times about the stories of the First Chicago School. They are, as the slide says, credited with the invention and mastery of steel framing and even really the modern office building. But they were one of the first true modern departures in architecture away from classical forms. And so in architecture, they're celebrated to great length and explained, and the personalities of the people involved explained. However, in engineering, it'd actually be relatively uncommon that we even would have heard in our engineering education any of these names, although maybe it's gotten better over time, thanks to a number of disciples out there trying to spread the word. But you may or may not have known that of the sort of primary players of the First Chicago School, that would be Major Jenny, Burnham and Root of the firm Burnham and Root, Adler and Sullivan. The ones in yellow that you see there, that's Root, Adler, and Jenny, were all trained as and practiced as engineers. And so they are celebrated for the architectural success that they were able to create and for the ideas that propagated into architecture. But they should be equally celebrated for the engineering prowess that they provided. And the role of engineering in that First Chicago School really can't be overstated in many ways. There's not enough time to tell the story of all these men. We'll talk a little bit about some of them. It's important, and Jenny is set off on his own right in the left, known as Major Jenny. He was a major in the Civil War. Burnham and Root worked in his office, as did Adler, for brief periods of time before splitting off and having their own firms. And so he is kind of the senior figure of the First Chicago School. But we will instead choose the young man in the upper right, John Wellborn Root, to be the major player in our story of the birth of the skyscraper in Chicago. So I think it behooves us now to learn a little bit about Mr. Root, probably someone that most of you haven't heard of before, and just see how it is that he came to play such a major role in this evolution of form. So the firm Burnham and Root is well recognized as one of the sort of key firms generating an enormous number of buildings in Chicago and then later outside of Chicago, of tall buildings that would eventually be in the sort of steel skeletal form. And they are part of a group credited with making the commercial office building or the high-rise building come to life. You'll see also that there's a number of quotes, like the one in the bottom from Daniel Burnham, where he's being relatively magnanimous about who sort of really did the designing for the early buildings of Burnham and Root, and crediting John Wellborn Root. And we're going to come to understand that John Root actually died a relatively young man. And one of the reasons he's a compelling figure is because a lot of the architects, engineers, architectural critics of the time came to comment on his life when they were at the height of their own powers because of his relatively untimely death. And so we have in his own writings and we have in the writings of others talking about him a really clear picture of what he was thinking and what he was trying to do as the skyscraper came to life after the Chicago fire. So let's learn a little bit about Mr. Root. He was born in the South pre-Civil War. and the tensions that were rising with regard to the Civil War and the fact that his family was relatively well-to-do and was convinced that he would be conscripted meant that in his pre-high school days, so about a year before high school, he was sent over to the UK for his training in Liverpool. He actually went to high school in Liverpool and was able to essentially avoid the Civil War and then would come back to get training as an engineer, and he would go to NYU for his civil engineering degree. So he moves from the South, resettles after he comes back from the UK in NYU, and is able to begin his practice as an engineer. So this is like, after he graduates from NYU, so it's like 1869, something like that. And his first job is to be the rod man, essentially, the surveying rod man for an earlier version that's since been destroyed of Grand Central Station in New York. So this massive iron train shed is kind of his first job coming out of school, and it's really a feat of engineering. You can see how light it is. Its basic form was meant to sort of mimic at least one of the main lines coming out of Paddington Station. So it was a conscious sort of copying of what was happening in the growth of the Industrial Revolution in the UK and Scotland, where things really took off the earliest and to the greatest extent. And he was exposed to that as a high school student in the UK, and then followed it further in his first jobs. So here you can see how light that early version of Grand Central Station actually was. And you can see what it looked like a little bit for the construction and the false work as they were building those arches. So the gentleman who was the boss of this particular job is a New York structural engineer, an owner at the time by the name of Peter White. And White was actually a pretty eloquent writer. And at the time of Root's death, talked quite a bit about and wrote quite a bit about John Root. They remained friends even after Root left his firm and had moved to Chicago after the fire. And in White's writings and also in Root's own writings, they talked a lot about two men who were much discussed in architecture and engineering at the time. John Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc. So we need to understand a little bit about what these men were writing about and what the debates of the time were to understand where Root sort of fell in terms of what he was trying to achieve when he designed structures. So there was this active debate that was really coming from Europe in the late and middle 1800s, not so much generating out of the U.S., and it was a debate around restoration, what to do with all of these older buildings that were having and needing some kind of restoration and repair in order for them to continue to be serviced. And there was a kind of argument. It still exists to today. This graphic is actually taken from a Rem Koolhaas exhibit in New York from just a couple of years ago to try to explain this sort of debate. And on the two sides, and neither side would appreciate the characterization that I give because they all sort of put a lot of verbiage to it. But in a simple sense, the authentic side, which is Ruskin, is essentially that you can only do your best to try to keep things the way they are, and to touch them is to destroy them. And so that is really your true north, and everything you're trying to do is keep things as authentic as possible. And any deviation from that is really something that's essentially impossible and will be a deviation from what could be great or what could be beautiful. And then there was Viollet-le-Duc's philosophy, which is that once you have engaged in the task of restoring a building, you are going to put it in a state that it has never existed in before, and so you should do, based on the knowledge you have today, what is the best restoration that you can possibly do to bring this thing forward. And that it doesn't necessarily have to be, quote-unquote, perfectly authentic. And some of this debate centered around the restorations and repairs that were underway on Gothic cathedrals. Viollet-le-Duc was a very prominent, fairly confident and robust restorer who talked a lot about what he was trying to achieve. And his writings were very influential for young engineers and architects. One of the things that Viollet-le-Duc promoted was that the structure makes the form, that buildings aren't beautiful because of the ornamentation or just the general shape that one chooses, but it's beautiful because it solves the actual problem, carrying gravity in an optimal way. Although when we look at Gothic cathedrals, we might find that a little bit harder to understand, there are details and evidence that have been done by modern engineers. Robert Mark at Princeton, John Oxendorf at MIT, for instance, have studied the role of these little pinnacles that you see like on the top of these masonry columns, or you see them out here with this sort of wonderful ornamentation on them, and has shown that there's a real substantial reason to put additional weight fully outboard on these masonry columns, because it makes a significant difference for the tensile stress at the bottom of the masonry tower to have this additional outboard weight. And it actually, under sort of normal kind of calculated wind surface conditions, actually makes a difference. And so this kind of thinking and that kind of discussion supports the ideas of Viollet-le-Duc that structure makes form, that even a Gothic cathedral, the structure is very conscientiously making the form, and we now find that to be beautiful. He had other ideas as well, which were interesting, about how one could take the best ideas of Gothic, but then translate them into modern materials. Not that these ideas for cast iron columns came into churches or bridges, but these were his ideas and examples of how one should approach the problem of design, even when one is trying to build something that is Gothic. So you don't make a fake Gothic. You take the ideas that led to Gothic and you make a new structure. And so when Peter White was trying to explain who this man, John Welborn Root, was that had such a significant role in creating skyscrapers, he would comment that he had an exceptional feeling for structure and that he could be described as an exponent of the principles of Viollet-le-Duc. And that for him, Gothic revival wasn't about making things that looked Gothic, but to take the constructive principles and what one learned in 12th and 13th century, but use them on the materials, facilities, and necessities of our time. So this is the man that we want to talk about, who would look and hear about the Chicago fire of 1871, choose to move to Chicago, and dedicate his life to building buildings in the Central Business District of Chicago. Should be a little careful on suggesting that all of this happened really fast or that it was simple. The fire happened in 1871. For 10 years, the downtown Chicago area is largely dedicated to removing rubble. There's some slapdash buildings that go up, essentially nothing permanent. It's the early 1880s before any real buildings are being rebuilt in the Central Business District. So we talk about resilience today, and we think about repairs, and we're all, I think, quite proud of resilient downtown Chicago. But maybe we're not always honest with ourselves with the time frames it takes to really do some of these things. These are heavy lifts, and it was for them then as it would be for us now. So what I thought I would do as we transition now from that kind of history lecture, or maybe a little bit to get a little bit more into the structural engineering and learn about what Root contributed. Look at some of his buildings. Burnham and Root designed an enormous number of buildings. This is a very small sample. We'll just pick a few and give you a sense of some of the innovations that they brought that would bring the skyscraper to life. And the first of those that I chose is the Montauk block. This sort of a relatively small, I think it's 10-story building. And there's many different definitions, and there's many different buildings which are considered to be the first skyscraper. And we're going to see a couple of those. But this is actually the first building to be called a skyscraper in print. It might not blow you away with its size. But in 1882, this is a tall building. And it is sort of the beginning of the first of tall building designs. And there are innovations already in the Montauk block that make it a building worth pausing a little bit and understanding how tall buildings came to be. Most of you probably know that the soil conditions in Chicago are pretty perverse for tall building design. A classical description of them using the language of the time in describing the soils would describe the first 12 to 15 feet underneath the building as hardpan. There is then an enormous squishy clay layer, more hardpan, and then finally bedrock. What this means is that at this time where you don't have deep foundations, you have to float your building with some kind of foundation into that hardpan. And you can't go very far into the hardpan because if you get down into the squishy clay, then you're going to have an enormous number of differential settlement problems. In fact, there was a post office in Chicago that was famous at this time for having huge, multiple feet's worth of settlement in its bottom floor and having all sorts of problems due to that large settlement. The solution that was used at the time was essentially at the base of any load-bearing column to make a pyramid of stone, right? I just cut stone and make a pyramid that would fan the load out so that the soil pressure would be distributed over a larger surface area and would be low enough that you wouldn't have problems. For a 1- or 2-story building, that pyramid was relatively small. The amount of hardpan that you could remove maybe to still keep your first floor kind of reasonable was just a foot or something or less, and that was fine. But for a building like this, calculations showed that you would have to have pyramids that would cut all the way through the hardpan, or in the entire first floor of your building would just be pyramids. And so you effectively would have no structure or no workable first floor. You would just walk into a bunch of pyramids of stone. So this would not work at all. The idea to solve this that Root came up with was that if he was to lay grid work of railroad line orthogonally underneath the columns and then pour in concrete, that he could create a foundation in a much shorter depth, which could be stiff enough to distribute the load out to the hardpan layer. And indeed, the first mat foundation was invented at Montauk Block, with the concept being generally credited to John Wellborn Root, and the engineer at the firm, Greg Ewan, being involved also in the patent and completion of that solution. So for sure, foundation changes were part of how they went up higher. One of the other big changes, and this is from a diagram a few years later, it's not the Montauk Block, was to figure out fire protection. So you would think after this huge fire in 1871 that they would take fire protection very seriously. And they did, right in the, let's see, I think it's 77, they build a relatively small building, 4- or 5-story building called the Grannis Block. Like all of these buildings, they're cast iron interior columns, and then all of the exterior is load-bearing masonry. And they put these terracotta tiles all up and down the interior columns. This one says steel column in the drawing, but that wouldn't actually be true for a number of years still. They were still cast iron at this point. And this was even actually the first home of Burnham and Root's business in the Grannis Block. But in 1870, I think 7 or 78, I have to look back at my notes, but I think it was 77, there was a fire at the Grannis Block in their own building, and the building is totally destroyed. But the only thing that's left in the rubble of the building is the columns. The columns are totally fine. They got this terracotta proofing, but they're on the ground because no one thought anything about fireproofing the floors in any way. And so one of the first buildings to have fireproof floors, and they used these plaster tile arches between the beams, was actually the Montauk Block. So this building, the simple building, but already had quite a bit of innovation in it. We turn to the second building of Root's design in our series, the Rookery. We'll see an evolution in the external form, and we'll see some really interesting evolutions in his design in the interior as well. The Rookery was completed, as it shows there, in 1886. You can see at this point there's still exterior masonry, that's load-bearing masonry. There's more expression The windows have gotten larger. In this building, Root is frustrated in his own writing about the final form. He's designed a number of buildings at this point. He wants to impress. He wants to create a building that will give you a lasting impression of importance, but he doesn't want to be neoclassical or neo-Gothic or anything. He has these other ideas, and he struggled greatly with a number of different structural expressions, and was not actually totally thrilled with the external form of the Rookery building. But it was details that he managed to achieve in the interior of the building that sort of had a lasting effect, and that he was indeed happy with. Just to talk a little bit more about how these buildings worked on two levels. So this is just a cross-section of the Rookery. So the thick drawings you see on the outside is load-bearing masonry. The relatively small columns you see on the interior are cast iron skeletal structures. So that was the system. That was the early system, the beginning of the Chicago skyscraper. So external load-bearing masonry thought to be needed for wind in particular, but also for gravity. There were concerns that a light building wouldn't make sense. And the other thing I want you to notice about this building is that the interior of the building is not office space, but an enormous multi-story light court. And we've rediscovered this in the last 15, 20 years with green building design, like Norman Foster and the Commerzbank building put a light court in a skyscraper because we want to have more interior light. And so you can see these buildings actually had exterior light and windows for every office. And what did it look like? To the eye of someone in this time, in the 1880s, the interior of this building would have looked very strange. Architectural critics now agree that this was the first direct expression of the sort of orthogonal beams and columns of an iron, in this case, later would be steel, skeletal structure. It's only on the interior columns because the exterior is masonry, but we can see, for sure, that very simple expression of these are the beams, these are the columns, these are the windows, that's it. You'll also notice this kind of interesting idea of having the staircase totally separate from the building. This spiral staircase is actually inboard into the light court and is separated from the building. In the 1960s, the Inland Steel building in Chicago would win major awards and accolades for doing the same things with its elevators. If you were to come down to the base of the light court, so basically the first story of this building, then the building would be complete, and you can be in this space. And this is where we really see how Root mastered detailed ironwork design and could create already large open spaces, large span spaces that he could put those in his building. So the glass up above is the light court exposed. You can see all of the ironwork. And then you also will see all of this white marble stone with this interesting gold patterns on it, very organic. At this point, we should comment that this building's been around for a while. It has itself seen restoration, and the person who restored this particular interior was actually Frank Lloyd Wright, and this was his vision for what the interior should look like. To be fair, the actual original interior courtyard was this, and you can see how much lighter the stairways are expressed, the columns that support the interior stairs, even the external columns. So what Root actually created was very much like the big train shed type structures that he grew up on. He created a big open space with very light metallic architecture, and it would only be Frank Lloyd Wright who would come in later and create this other sort of vision of what that might look like. There's one other kind of interesting side story about Burnham and Root's buildings, and this building in particular, and that is that their office actually was inside this building. They often would build a building and then move their firm to the space. And this is a drawing of what the Burnham and Root office looked like. And so you can see the drafting tables there in the middle. In the lower right, if you sort of read carefully, you can see Burnham and Root. You see Mr. Burnham's office. You see Mr. Root's studio. The engineer, who would have been Ewan at that time, just gets called the chief engineer. Root is an engineer as well, but there's another engineer that actually runs the drafting tables. You'll notice in the lower left there's a gymnasium, relatively small office space in order to give up that much space for a gymnasium. Daniel Burnham is a pretty brash character. Burnham and Root actually met on the drafting tables at William Baron-Jenney's firm, and he convinced Root to go out and have their own firm. Burnham really was the handshaker and the business manager and the one who brought in a lot of the jobs, and he liked to fence. And so he built a gymnasium in his office, and he would wander his way after coming back from his I don't know how many martini lunch, and then grab someone from the drafting room, declare that they needed to go fencing, and then he would fence them in the gymnasium. I can't imagine that would be particularly well received today if your boss was to come brandish a sword at you, but it was a different time. You can get a sense of kind of Burnham's personality from the quote down below and maybe what he thought about engineers, at least at that point. Essentially arguing that you can hire any number of engineers to do the grunt work for you. That quote came before Burnham actually himself tried to design a hotel roof in Kansas City that would collapse during construction as a sort of a lightweight steel joist type of roof that he didn't fully understand. And at least later in his life, he came to appreciate the limit of his powers and what the engineers were providing. But you can certainly see that that wasn't always his thinking. A couple more buildings that we want to talk about under the design of Root. And it's the Monadnock building we look to next. And this is the building that architects generally turn to first in trying to explain what the first Chicago school is all about. You can see that the building is very simple now. It has none of the sort of classical features. Early tall building design, in looking for a precedent for how they should make the building, was very focused on the classical orders for columns. And so they would try to make a building have a sort of a base, a shaft, and a capital. And the base would have some kind of ornamentation. It could be any of the sort of classic orders, and then a shaft sort of section where things would be the same, and then a capital that would be at the top. Root wasn't satisfied with that idea. He felt that it created something that was a bit artificial, and he wanted to look in other directions. And the folks that were actually investing and building this building at the time wanted the tallest building in Chicago, and he had a great idea, and his idea was that he was going to design the building completely out of steel. So I'll just show you. Yeah, so this is a couple boys from Medford, Mass, who are actually the investors in the building, in the Monadnock building, and they had a lawyer who worked with them, and Root proposed to make a building where the exterior and the interior would all be iron columns. The lawyer responded in a letter that might be a cheap investment, but surely it would not last in time, and that he rejected it without giving it to the owners. And as a result of that lawyer's input, this building becomes the last masonry skyscraper of the Chicago school instead of the first skeletal iron skyscraper, which is what it would have been. So the final plan uses interior iron columns, but still uses exterior masonry. Because of the relatively large height, there's a need to expand the exterior masonry as you get to the bottom of the building. And you can see that here as a modern-day picture of the Monadnock building and a federal office building that's directly across from it. And so you can see where the Chicago school essentially would take us from that time going forward. So a brief moment to talk about another building before we go back to Root, to talk about William LeBaron Jenney's home insurance building. You would often find folks that would say, and I think it was reasonable evidence, that this is the first skeletal steel or skeletal iron skyscraper. The home insurance building was the first building to use actually iron columns on the exterior of the building as well as the interior. It's still the facade was covered with masonry. You can see a small piece of it here. But the bulk of the columns were cast iron. I say the bulk of the columns because our own Charlie Carter from AISC had the benefit of talking with some folks that actually gave him a small sample of an upper floor of the home insurance building when it was under restoration. And there's evidence that there was some steel that went into this first skyscraper. And there's a wonderful modern steel construction article that Charlie wrote that you can look up to learn a little bit more about that story. The first building that's skeletal and steel actually happens very soon after this, and that is the Rand McNally building. It's no longer existing. It's been destroyed, so we just have simple pictures of it designed actually by Root. So you can see in this drawing a couple of buildings. The one with the number 2 on it is the Rookery building. The one with the 3 on it is an existing building that's next door to the building with a 4, which is the Rand McNally building, which is the first steel skeletal skyscraper building. Even to build this building required a significant amount of innovation. And the transition from iron to steel has a lot to do with the local conditions of this building. So Building 3 was already built at the time that Building 4 was desired to be constructed. If we take a peek at the base of that building, this is the foundation. And there was a significant problem in that you couldn't easily get the load of the new Rand McNally building into the ground because the foundation of Building 3 already used these sort of cut stone pyramid type of solution and was taking up a huge amount of space. And so this building actually has one of the first large-scale transfer girders in it, a foundation girder. But even still, the weight was really significant. And one of the things that happened in the transition from cast iron columns to steel riveted columns was that based on the understanding and sort of reliability and certainty of our ability to predict the forces and the capacities of those columns, the general safety factor that was being used at the time switched from a safety factor on direct stress of 8 from cast iron columns to 4 for steel riveted columns. And so the self-weight of the building halved because we actually changed the safety factor in half. And then the self-weight of the building halved again when we removed all the masonry. And the primary reason initially to make that change at the Rand McNally building was because they couldn't make the foundations work any other way. And so it is local constraints creating an engineering optimal solution to push us forward with our technology. And this is a story that we find actually happening a lot more. Constraints can be very frustrating, but they are often the mother of invention. This is a cross-section of what the Rand McNally building looked like. So you can see it's a very simple framing system. Talk a little bit more about these steel columns. So they come onto the scene in the 1870s, and by 1890, it's done. You know, there's just a few buildings built with the cast iron, and then there's an enormous transfer over to steel columns. And people like Root and Jenny are giving lectures, writing papers, talking about why you should make this switch and what the advantages are. So you can see when the technology is right and when it solves the problem, there's just this huge and very quick switch. Of course, the columns look a little bit different than they do today. You can see some of the examples of these riveted columns in the pictures here. And there's a fascinating story to be told about that whole industry and what it's become today and these interesting columns. But I would like to just take you back a couple slides and have you look once more at the vertical cross-section of the Rand McNally building, the elevation section. And I wonder if in looking at it and thinking about it as a steel skeletal building, if it gives you any pause at all with regard to whether or not it's really a safe design. And to add a little bit to that, let me give you a quote from the Engineering News Record, just called the Engineering Record at that time in 1893. Talking about the construction of skeleton buildings has but recently been commenced, hence but little opportunity has been afforded to test them in the face of ordinarily destructive winds. As a general rule, however, it may be considered very indifferent engineering that is fortified only by a lack of failure. If the construction is sound in principle, it can be shown to be so, but if its character is not capable of a clear defense, it can only be regarded with well-grounded suspicion. So the engineer is skeptic has always been important to us, and we were right to be skeptical. The load-bearing system for wind was essentially the gravity weight of the masonry, which we removed in these still skeletal structures. And so we needed to replace it with something to resolve those large wind forces. And there was a great deal of innovation that would go into that. You would see all sorts of different types of rod bracing, knee bracing, portal frame bracing, a number of different solutions that would be tried and used. Root wrote about and in favor of the use of rod bracing as an excellent solution, and he got involved very near to his death in the design of a building that was going to try a different type of resistance to wind, what we now know as a moment frame system. Unfortunately, he died before that building was completed. And so we only have his sort of initial ideas and designs, and that building would actually be completed by the firm of Burnham and Root. But now there would be new players such as the engineer Atwood, who would be hired and would be generally the one that would finish the Reliance building. But in the Reliance building, coming from the firm of Burnham and Root, starting with some of the ideas from John Wellborn Root, we come to really the conclusion of what the first Chicago construction could look like. So here you see an older picture, 1895, with Burnham's firm working with Atwood and also Shanklin as the engineer. And we can see in a modern picture really how light this building is. So some of the architectural features known as the Chicago window, you see the very light windows. You see something very similar to the interior light court of the Rookery building, but now being expressed as the exterior of the building, because this is there is no load-bearing masonry. The entire structure is now skeletal steel construction. They didn't have a name for this moment frame construction at the time. And the descriptions in their own words at the time, sort of how do you describe what they're doing, they would look to carpentry and they would describe the idea of table leg design. So when you would put a kitchen table and you would put the leg on, there's a number of different ways to make that a stiff connection, but there's a type of design where you essentially make a full, complete moment connection between the bottom of the table leg or the top of the table leg and the bottom of the table. And so with cast iron solutions, that sort of detailing looks something like the modern day rendering that you see here. And the detailing of that connection is credited to the engineer Shanklin. And so Root's involved in the sort of whole creation of the skyscrapers, the conversion to steel skyscrapers, and even sort of the final, this is what Chicago School brings us in terms of all steel skeletal construction, and the sort of most efficient form at the time for building the high-rise skyscraper. So just a few words about Root and a kind of brief denouement. One of the reasons that I choose to use Root to tell this story is because his writing is very sympathetic to an idea that is now known as structural art, and that is the notion that the highest form of structural engineering, one that fully embraces the social, scientific, and symbolic constraints and achievements that you're trying to solve and that one particular engineering problem generally leads to something which is simple and in its simplicity beautiful. So it's not simple and brutal, but simple and elegant. And so that is a branch that exists in architecture as well. And Root is trying to make it clear that when something is providing an important structural feature like a column, it should be expressed as a column and nothing else, and that things should be simple, they should be direct, and there should be a sort of moderation in what you apply. And so with those writings, we firmly ensconce Root in the camp of that simplicity, directness, and moderation. However, Chicago becomes quite successful. Burnham, Atwood, Sullivan, Adler, all of the rest of the players in the first Chicago school go on to become involved in the World's Columbian Exhibition, like a World's Fair in Chicago, and money coming into Chicago at a huge level of finance for whatever you want to build. And so they sort of, without this constraint of economy and the need to build these office buildings quickly, efficiently, and meet all these needs for these white-collar office workers, they instead fully embrace neo-Gothic, neoclassical, obelisks, anything you like, everything goes, make it look like old Europe, new whatever, and create a whole litany of structures that are in the exact opposite direction. Root has the decency to die instead of sort of running through that. And so as a result, his sort of contribution is very clean, and the contribution of the others is much more complicated to talk about as they lived out their entire career. To bring the story at least a little bit to modern day so that it isn't just a history lecture, it's worth noting that there was a second Chicago school, both in architecture and engineering, and that the principles of simplicity, directness, and moderation, the principles of structural art, of which Root was arguing for, still exist today. We see it nowhere more forcefully than in Fosler Kahn's building in downtown Chicago, the wonderful John Hancock Tower, and the evolution of the truss tube, sort of showing us how we can go even higher with a still skeletal skyscraper form, or in the works of Les Robertson, most prominently in the Bank of China Tower, or in our sort of foremost structural artist of the day, Bill Baker, not just with his high-rise buildings, but in buildings like Broadgate Exchange, his own self-proclaimed favorite building, where the building is literally a bridge and a building at the same time because it has to span over railroad tracks and is an incredible, marvelous steel construction. And it isn't just as simple as, expressing steel and having steel on the outside. There are examples like Norman Foster's HSBC bank building in Hong Kong, which has an enormous amount of steel expression, but doesn't necessarily do it for any kind of efficiency and ends up costing a huge amount of money, and so sort of fails us in sort of efficiency and economy, and doesn't actually take us in those principles and directions that Root was trying to take us. Or you can see, a more a modern example even in the CCTV building in Chicago, which tries to sort of put forth a notion of being efficient and optimized in its steel structural solution, but the overall form was chosen in a way that the efficiency was impossible since you're cantilevering out enormous weight from a huge building, and so you're not really taking the problem under its full constraints. You took a sculptural idea and you realized it in steel, but you didn't actually solve the functional issue in an efficient way. But with that, we can come to our coda. And two final words about our hero, John Wellborn Root, and the birth of the skyscraper. And so I would first leave you with the historian Carl Condit, who's now wrote a nice piece about Root, and he's just sort of suggesting to you that his creative powers in structural engineering match those of the artist. And I would like to promote that we can say that about all the best structural engineers. And we shouldn't be ashamed to. We should be excited to say that there is enormous art in solving difficult structural engineering problems, and our best structural engineers are indeed artists. And then a quote from Root himself, which I quite enjoy, which is just sort of notion that it's like any difficult problem. You know you've solved it when you found the simple answer. Finding a complex answer that sort of works is relatively easy. But the simplest arrangement is hard, and it's best fit to our greatest buildings. So with that, I conclude. I turn the ball back over to Brent for a few minutes, and I look forward to more discussion and answering some of your questions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And we do have some questions from the audience, but we're going to ask the audience, we're going to ask them a question first. If you do have a question, we still have time for you to submit those, so feel free to use that chat feature to submit your questions to Dr. Schaefer. All right, let's do a polling question for today's lecture. So here's our question. Numerous conditions gave rise to the steel skyscraper. Which one of these below did not? A, lower safety factor for steel than iron. B, radical change in how buildings were financed. C, increased need for white-collar office space. D, safe elevators and improved fire protection. Or E, improved foundation technologies. So go ahead on your screen, click on the radio button that you think is the correct answer. Give people a few minutes to participate here. Maybe not a few minutes, a few more seconds. Let me read that again. Numerous conditions gave rise to the steel skyscraper. Which of these did not? Lower safety factor for steel than iron. Radical change in how buildings were financed. Increased need for white-collar office space. Safe elevators and improved fire protection. Or improved foundation technologies. All right, last chance to get your answer in. Okay. I'm going to close the poll here. And Ben, about half of the respondents said B, change in financing of buildings. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. So that is correct. That was one thing that didn't see any radical change over this time period, and so we should be happy. And then it's a good question if I fool some of the students, so I'm happy as a professor because I didn't make it easy to get the A. So everyone should be happy.
Okay.
But the rest, A, C, D, E, and F, all did indeed happen.
Great. Okay, let's answer some questions with the time we have left. First question we have, is there a standard or design manual for cast iron columns and beams from the 1800s?
That is an excellent question. There certainly was manufacturer-produced guidelines that would come from the producers. To my knowledge, I don't know of any sort of organizationally created standard at the time. And I know that the architects and engineers that were designing these buildings met weekly in kind of clubs. And I understand from kind of looking at some of the minutes of those clubs and things when I was researching some of this work that they did discuss those. Those were items of discussion at those meetings. So it's quite possible that they were more kind of discussed practice as opposed to settled law the way we do it now.
Okay. Our next question is, what was the grade of the steel? What was the yield strength of the early buildings until the 1960s?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know specifically the grades of the steel that were used in the Chicago buildings, but I can speak to what was being used in steel and bridges. So the first long-span steel bridge in the United States was in the late 1800s, and that was the Eads Bridge post-Civil War in St. Louis. It's an arch bridge. It used steel staves turned into tubes. It was done by James Buchanan Eads, and he demanded that all the steel have tensile pulls of 55,000 psi. So they were actually using greater than 50 ksi steel from the very beginning. It was later that the sort of push to a lower grade steel that could be mass produced, and the sort of the A36 type stuff that we got used to would come alive. In the beginning, steel was actually of higher strength in most of its situations.
Okay, let's see here. I'm trying to find the slide. There's a question about the Rand McNally building. Here it is. Yeah,
Good as any. Yep.
The question is, what exactly happened to the Rand McNally building?
Progress. Destroyed and replaced for a taller building. So nothing too exciting.
Okay.
It wasn't known at the time as an important building with regard to its still skeletal nature in any sort of specific way. I believe the first time that it was sort of unearthed and the timelines were put together was by a historian actually here at Hopkins, Daniel Hoffman, that wrote extensively en route and sort of made the argument and sort of figured out the timeline of the buildings, that this was really actually the first building that was skeletal steel.
Okay. I guess back to a question of how these early buildings were designed. Were there any kind of calculations that were generated as part of designing these skyscrapers, and were they required by the authority having jurisdiction for review?
Yeah, we live in a different time now, a different world, don't we? There were drawings. There were calculations. I don't know, and would need to confer with others to understand exactly how the regulatory environment of the Chicago Building Code was post-fire, to tell you exactly how that sort of would have been approved or anything. But it was completely a local affair, right? I mean, so this was Chicago's business. It wasn't structural engineers' business or the nation's business or whatever. This was something between the builders who were designing in Chicago and the city of Chicago. You can understand at that time, with the speed and desire of construction, I don't think there was much hampering in innovation. If the building went up and people were happy to finance it and move into it, I think that was considered successful.
Okay, a couple more questions. We'll wrap things up. I'm going to butcher this, the Monadnock building. The question is, this was built in 1883 but was demolished in 1902. Do we know why it was demolished in such a short span of time?
I actually don't. I mean, I don't know the exact reason why Montauk was just demolished and rebuilt. We can say, and we can look, the number of buildings that survive from that sort of 1880s to 1920s time is actually relatively small, because there's so much more reconstruction and we can go so much taller. So once they figure out the steel skeletal skyscraper, they're really cooking until through the 20s. So the building that happens in Chicago up through the Great Depression is enormous, and they're building and rebuilding, and it's a huge amount. And then it's just after the Great Depression, there's nothing built in Chicago for a very, very long time. And so I think there are a few like the Rookery and Monadnock which have stood the test of time. But Burnham and Root, commissioned hundreds of buildings, most of which don't exist now in Chicago.
Okay. Last question, just looking for your opinion. Which of these historical steel skyscrapers lands as your favorite?
The interior of the Rookery is just incredible, even after Frank Lloyd Wright stuff, which is beautiful in its own right. So if you could only visit one of what I showed today, even though it doesn't meet perfectly the simplicity, directness, moderation type of mantra, it speaks to a time and an artistry that I really appreciate, and I find it quite gorgeous.
All right, very good. Well, thank you very much, Ben. Greatly appreciate your willingness to present today's Steel Day webinar.